Well, we are here in the third week of Ordinary Time as we started yesterday, but this is the first day, because yesterday, of course, was a feast, that we're going to continue in Samuel, but now we're in 2 Samuel. So we've been reading 1 Samuel and excerpts all the way through, and now we're reading 2 Samuel, and we're well into the kingdom of David. Now, over the weekend was the story of the demise of Saul and Jonathan and what had happened. This is a story I use all the time in funerals. Remember who Saul was, the first king of Israel. Who was Jonathan, his son? Jonathan and David had an intense friendship. Many people of our current age describe it as maybe being a gay relationship. And I would say possibly, but not sexually. And it's important because remember, in the book of Leviticus, a sexual relationship could lead to the death of those people involved, and Saul hated David. So if he was looking for a reason to kill David, he had one. So that's why I always say that. But the reason why that's also important to say is that a gay relationship is better to ask the question, is the definition of gay wrong? And here's the reason. They had an intense friendship, what Alred of Ravoux would call a spiritual friendship. Now, David later got married many times. He had many wives, and of course he committed adultery, and that's a story for another time. But that's one of the things that I think it's important to look at today. What people describe as gay, 2 guys who have an intense friendship, does not necessarily mean sexually, may actually not be gay at all. It may be the way friendships are actually called to be. I don't know. Obviously, I don't have a friendship to that level, but you understand that reality. That's important to, and a person or 2 people who did have that kind of friendship are Saint Cardinal Henry Newman and Ambrose St. John had an intense relationship, and according to NPR, they shared everything but a marriage bed. So that's the kind of relationship that I'm thinking happened between David and Jonathan. They had an intense friendship relationship. What happens is that there's a battle coming up. Saul, as you know, has been dismissed by God as king. God still loves him and everything, but he's not working out as king. And Samuel is dead. Samuel has died. Even though we're continuing in the book of Samuel, Samuel actually has died. And I tell the story in many funerals. And what happens is Saul doesn't know what to do. This battle is coming up. It's going to be an intense battle. And he goes to Samuel. He goes to a psychic. She's called the Witch of Endor. And he goes to the psychic and asks the psychic to raise Samuel, who is not happy about being raised. And I was explaining funerals because he was happy where he was. And which is an important message to keep in mind when someone is, very upset about the loss of a loved one. Say, you wouldn't want them back because they're happy where they are. So we look at that, and so Samuel basically says, it's not going to go well with you. And the battle happens. Jonathan is killed. Saul basically falls on his sword. And but he doesn't die. And so the sword, actually it's his spear, is holding him up. And there's an Amalekite. Remember, the Amalekites They hated Israel as much as Iran hates Israel. So, and this Amalekite is there. But what happens is Saul is saying, please kill me, because he's in so much pain and he's being held up by the spear. And the Amalekite does that. And then he goes and tells David, who is now king, what happened to Saul. And of course, they use all this language, the messengers. They didn't talk necessarily directly, the Amalekite tells the story of how Saul died, and David, of course, is upset. He recognizes that he is still the Lord, that Saul is still the Lord's anointed, but he has been killed. And then he does what I told you David is famous for. He kills the messenger. And he says, you yourself admitted to the fact, these aren't his exact words or anywhere close, that you killed the Lord's anointed. And so he kills the messenger. That was, like I said, I've said it many times, you never wanted to give David bad news. And remember, the one who decides whether or not it's bad news is David. You might think it's good news, but if David doesn't like it, that's not going to go well for you. And so he kills the messenger. Now, we are well into the kingdom of David. And this is an important story. What happens is that David comes to realize that the ark is in the possession of someone who's doing very well with it, but he decides it's important to have it where he lives because he is the king, and make it basically the ark the center of the kingdom. And so this whole story is about a march with the ark. And what they do is they walk six steps, and then they sacrifice an animal to God. Remember, the Jews believed in Israel. We don't call them Jews yet. Israel believed in sacrificing animals as a replacement for human sacrifice. Because remember, from the time of Abraham, Israel never believed in human sacrifice. From the time of Abraham, whereas all the cultures around them, right up until the Romans and later the Spanish came to the Americas. It's a fascinating thing why all these cultures believed in human sacrifice, and they all did. But anyway, so they would sacrifice an animal every 6 steps as they're bringing the ark back to where David lives, where essentially it belongs. And the ark obviously eventually goes into the temple, which hasn't been built yet and won't be built until the time of Solomon. So in any case, they're doing that. And I told you yesterday that they left out a verse. As they do, they skip around, they being the people who decide what we're going to read at Mass, and they left out a verse. And the verse is where David is dancing before the ark. And there's 2 things that are important to recognize with that. First of all, one of the reasons why they may have left it out is because one of the people who witnesses this finds this very disturbing. And so here he is dancing before the ark, and actually, maybe it is here. Oh, wow. Let me see. Came before. Yeah, I guess it is there. I'm sorry. And it was the daughter of Saul who wasn't happy seeing David leaping and dancing. Let me bring this up on the Dewey Rams, because that way I don't have to worry about the famous problem with copyrights. And so we're going to go to 2 Samuel 6, and we're going to look at verse 16. Hello, we're going to do this again. 2 Samuel 6. Hello, let's do this. Okay, we're going to 2 Samuel 6, verse 16. And it's another verse that talks about him dancing. He's dancing and leaping. So he's celebrating. And she despised David for doing that, and because she was Saul's daughter. But he wasn't celebrating the death of Saul. He was celebrating that God was in their midst, or is in their midst, because that's the whole reality of the ark. The ark is God in their midst, and he's celebrating that, and he's all kinds of joyful. So he's dancing and leaping. Now, if you remember Footloose, and in Footloose, that's, if you remember the movie, and I'm thinking of the Kevin Bacon version, where this teenager comes in from New York, and he's all excited about dancing and everything else, and he comes to this town where we don't do dancing here. Around here, we don't do dancing. And it becomes a religious battle, if you remember, because in some non-Catholic Christian faiths, dancing is considered a sin. And we've had something similar in the Catholic Church. better be careful. Leave room for the Holy Spirit, because this is from the Catholic perspective, even though I'm using the wrong accent. Because what comes next. But dancing was forbidden, or is forbidden in some non-Catholic Christian religions. And so if you remember the movie, it was all set up as this idea of between dancing and not. But what had happened, if you remember the story, was they did have a dance at one time, and kids coming home, I think they had been drinking, had a severe accident, and they all died, and that was tragic, and people were still mourning that. But here it is, this other side. This was the verse that was used to say we want to dance. And here it is, this verse talking about David dancing and leaping before the tabernacle. Now, the Ark of the Covenant, also called the tabernacle. Now, here's an interesting thing to keep in mind, and that is he's dancing and leaping before the tabernacle. If you want to see some people turn against you in a millisecond, just talk about liturgical dance. I've only seen it twice in my life. And a liturgical dance is based on these ideas that you see in the Old Testament, and it's people who dance before the tabernacle, and this is wrong, this is terrible. It reminds me of a time, I was thinking about this the other day. I was listening to a program where they played Riding the Storm Out by REO Speedwagon. I forget what show I was listening to. And so they were playing Riding the Storm Out. It might have been Coast to Coast AM. Well, in any case, they're playing Riding the Storm Out. Well, we had a band on our ship, the USS Prairie, and the band was great, and they had this excellent version of Riding the Storm Out. Well, we pulled into Japan, and in Yokosuka, Japan, and there was this, in the enlisted men's club was, and I can still remember the name, Brian Lowback and the Sounds of Country, and they used to play in the enlisted men's club every night. The problem was they used to play everything exactly the same, even the introduction and everything else, the same way every night when we were there. I mean, he might have changed it every month. I don't know. But we were there for 3 weeks and literally the same routine. And they had a contest, but one night they had a contest and to have these ships' bands come together, and all the other bands played country and our band played rock and roll. And obviously they lost, but the judges were fair. They said, look, your band sounds great, but this is a country contest. So, sorry, it doesn't count. We gave him that because the man was really great. But I remember people would call out to Brian Lomback, who, I get a kick out of it, but you have to realize this man entertained sailors in Yokosuka, Japan, playing country music, which is very American. So even though I may be a little critical of Brian Lomback, the fact that he did that in Japan all the time, I think that is really, really honorable, and I think that needs to be said. And by the way, one of his men, right around that time, the song from Charlie Daniels, The Devil Goes Down to Georgia, and one of his men learned the fiddle part in The Devil Goes Down to Georgia and did it excellently. So give him his due. I may not have agreed with his style, but I clearly honor him for what he did. And here he was entertaining the troops, so to speak, out there in Yokosuka, Japan. Well, in any case, he used to say, Brian Lomback and the Sounds of Country does not play rock and roll. Well, think of that attitude and think of the people saying, we don't allow dance here because from their background, they don't want dance, and also the history. That was Footloose. And that is some non-Catholic Christian religions who come out and say, well, dance is wrong. They'll be just like that. But what do we see? And they'll do the same thing for liturgical dance in the Catholic Church. We don't like this liturgical dance. But you can go all the way back to the Bible and see dancing before the tabernacle is wonderful as we see David. But what's so important about it? You have to realize, what are they doing? They're celebrating that God is in their midst. Why is that important? Who does Jesus become? God in their midst. Jesus is, but when he is incarnated, we can say God is in our midst. This is an intensely important verse, and it's something we always want to celebrate every day. God is in our midst. It's a very powerful reading that we have today. We're going to be back on the other side of the break. You're listening to the Catholic Audio Media Podcast on your favorite podcast platform. Subscribe, like, comment, spread the word. We'll be right back. Did you know that the Catholic Audio Media Podcast is available on various podcast platforms? You can find us, among others, on Podbean, which is our home platform. You can find it on Spotify, Amazon Music, iHeart, among others. Just look for Catholic Audio Media, all one word. On some platforms, such as Spotify, look for Catholic Audio Media, 3 words, and subscribe and listen to the Catholic Audio Media Podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to us on Patreon. Patreon.com/Catholic Audio Media. Patreon.com/Catholic Audio Media. Check us out. Check what we have to offer. Previews of upcoming podcasts. Previews of upcoming columns over at CatholicAudiomedia.substack.com. Your ability to comment, make suggestions, even make suggestions in upcoming programs. Check us out. Patreon.com, Catholic Audio Media. We're back, and here we are. We're talking about this whole story of David and dancing before the Ark of the Covenant, celebrating that God is in their midst. As you know, I like to talk about some news items in the second half of the program, and something came up that I thought was important. I'm in the midst of reading this book that's making its rounds. It's called The Invisible Coup: How American Elites and Foreign Powers Use Immigration as a Weapon. And I started to read it because I heard about this, and I started to read it. And it's an interesting book, but I have to admit, there are parts of it, I think, that are not well explained. And so I wanted to touch on some parts. First of all, you do realize that if there are people who are sent here from other countries in order to bring foreign influence or whatever into the country, that doesn't mean every person from that country, legal or illegal, is part of that little system. As a matter of fact, generally you'll find the vast majority of people are not. And I've never met anyone who was an agent for another country that I know of, except for other Americans who are, when I was in the military, we were all agents of the, but everyone knew that because we wore the uniform, the whole bit. But there was something in here I thought I wanted to share. And he talks about Gustavo Guttierez. Actually, his name is Father Gustavo Guttierez, who is the father of liberation theology. And he talks about liberation theology. And liberation theology is a theology that the Vatican has been critical of. And it's a theology that uses what is known as Marxist analysis to understand the issues of the world and how to address them within a gospel category. And yes, the Vatican does not agree with liberation theology. However, the way the author of this book, Peter Schweitzer, writes about Gustavo Guttierez, I thought it's important to make some comments on it. First of all, he doesn't really go into much detail about Gustavo Guttierez, Father Gustavo Guttierez, and why he created liberation theology, and with others as well. There are many liberation theologians. And, another one is John Sobrino, and you can find a correction. I think Gustavo Guttierez. You can find documents on the Vatican website in the Dicastery of the Doctrine of the Faith that will give what they disagree with these theologians. John Sobrino from El Salvador is another one. And so Gustavo Guttierez, again, was the father of liberation theology. He has since passed away. He died in 2017. One of the things to keep in mind is that his form of liberation theology is rooted specifically in Latin America. And Peter Schweitzer says that. That's true. But he doesn't go into, Peter Schweitzer, some of the details of why. And the reason is that the poverty in South America is intense. And a lot of people don't understand that. And with poverty comes corruption. Part of the reason for the poverty is the great debts that these countries have. And this is why they have these governments that are what they are. This is why they have these governments, because the governments are promising the people to bring to have a better life, as all governments do, and they tend to come in from the perspective of, well, it's the rich are the fault, the rich are the reason, the whole bit. No, that may or may not be true, but you do have to understand. No, when I say that, that's the politicians. The poverty is intense. People are very poor. As a matter of fact, we lived in an area in Ecuador where all the people lived, and they were in a neighborhood, and we thought, this is interesting. And the people lived basically in shacks. I mean, oh, this is interesting. And come to find out, they were squatters. They were all living on land that they essentially stole, or maybe it belonged to the state, and they just said, we're going to live here, whether you like it or not. And they had electricity in their shacks, and that was stolen too. They were basically living, and we look at that and saying, that's horrendous. How can people do that? But you have to realize, if they didn't have that, they would have even less. And right across the river were people who had swimming pools and mansions. So you can see the poverty level in South America is huge. And Gustavo Guttierez, Father Gustavo Guttierez, basically put together, and others, liberation theology is a way to address this situation. Now, there was a conference, which I'll have to look it up to see if Peter Schweitzer mentions it, and it was in the late 70s called I believe in the late 70s, the Puebla Conference, that talked about this was an issue in these countries. The extreme poverty is a real issue, in this extreme riches and the extreme poverty. And why that's a problem is, from extreme poverty comes corruption. And if you want to stop illegal immigration and stop corruption, you develop these countries and you build up the economy of these countries. That's what really has to be done, because it's kind of like water. Water is going to flow where it's going to reach its own level. Well, if you have extreme poverty in South America and you have extreme riches in North America, and people are taught in South America, if you have a car, it may only have 3 wheels, but it's still a car. You're considered rich, right? So in South America, you've got the people who are so poor. That's why you have illegal immigration. Now, what he talks about is some governments are using people to infiltrate our government. Where does it start? It starts with the extreme poverty. He doesn't get into that at all. There's another part I just kind of clicked, and it really bothered me. He said, and Gustavo Guttierez did meet with Pope Francis in the Vatican. Yeah. He also met with Pope Benedict, and I do believe he met with John Paul II. And if he didn't, John Paul II met with him in either Peru or Colombia at the Puebla conference. So, this whole thing, he met with Pope, because he really tears on Pope Francis. He met with Pope Francis. He met with all the popes. But the other thing he doesn't bring up, because he says, and he was in Peru, and then he comes into Gustavo Guttierez, Father Gustavo Guttierez, gave a seminar every summer at Boston College on liberation theology. So he didn't work behind the scenes. He didn't work like certain people who teach about revolution, just always stay behind the scenes. And when when they're confronted on it, they wasn't me. No, he wasn't like that at all. He was a person And he taught a theology that says, how do we address this reality? Now, let me tell you something. I'm not a adherent to liberation theology, but I understand it. I've studied it. I know it. And they were talking about, the rich and dealing with the rich and the whole bit. And there's a lot of that in liberation theology. And I remember talking to my professor, and I said, no, we should be teaching about sin and changing people and changing people's hearts. That's what we're called to do. Well, he says, you were in the Philippines under Ferdinand Marcos. I said, yes, I was. He said, would that work with Ferdinand Marcos? I said, no, it wouldn't. He says, that's my point. That's my point. He said, no, that's not going to work. And he's right. I mean, if I went to Ferdinand Marcos, let's put it this way. I'm talking about the father, not the son as the current president, but father, when he was exiled from the Philippines during that whole time, he said he was considering suicide, but he realized it was against his Catholic faith. And that for me was a coffee spit moment, because we know all the corruption that was there. And we're going, wait a minute, all the rest of that is a sin too. Hello? Do you understand? You've got Peter Schweitzer. He doesn't really go into good detail of who Gustavo Guttierez was. Now, and the relationship with Pope Francis. Pope Francis was from Argentina, but also Pope Benedict and also Pope John Paul II, and his conference every year at Boston College. So it's not like he was working behind the scenes. He was very, very well known in a lot of theological circles, and that was liberation theology. I don't agree with liberation theology, and I'll make that very clear. But this is something he really didn't go into well, maybe because it was only a small part of his book, but I thought it was important to make that clear. It's called The Visible Coup by Peter Schweitzer. We'll be back right after this. Going back to receive your high school diploma can make a huge difference in your life, not just for you, but for your loved ones and your community as well. Across the country, thousands of free adult education centers are ready to help with teachers who will guide you every step of the way. Find free and supportive adult education centers near you at finishyourdiploma.org. Brought to you by the Dollar General Literacy Foundation and the Ad Council and the Catholic Audio Media Podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to us on Patreon, patreon.com/Catholic Audio Media, patreon.com/Catholic Audio Media. Check us out. Check what we have to offer, previews of upcoming podcasts, previews of upcoming columns over at catholicaudiomedia.substack.com, your ability to comment, make suggestions, even make suggestions in upcoming programs. Check us out, patreon.com, Catholic Audio Media. We're back, and tomorrow we're going to look more into 2 Samuel, and we're going to see, at least the first during this time, David's prophet. Remember, Saul had a prophet that was Samuel. David had a prophet that was Nathan, and he was an interesting character as well. And what we're going to look at is why it wasn't until the time of Solomon that we see a temple in Jerusalem, because David thought of it and the Lord said no, but we'll see all that tomorrow. But it's fascinating to see this, because remember, all this history helps us to understand the current time and everything else. Speaking of which, what I was just talking about is liberation theology. Understand, and by the way, look that up. Look up John Sobrino. Look up Leonardo Boff at the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith. Look at what the Vatican says, their criticism, what they like, what they don't like, and their criticism of them. Gustavo Guttierez, see what they say. I mean, look it up and read all those documents. Maybe that's something I should do. What did the Vatican say about John Sobrino? Say to John Sobrino and Leonardo Boff, and if there's a document on, I believe there is, Gustavo Guttierez and liberation theology. Maybe that's something I should put together. In any case, so we're going to talk tomorrow of the Lord saying that he doesn't need a temple yet. We'll be back then. Have a blessed day. The Catholic teaching in this podcast is reflected and presented as accurately as possible. The opinions expressed are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of the Archdiocese of Boston or any other institution.